I'm joined with Dr. Apala Das, who received her PhD from the University of Toronto in 2024. And currently you work at Bilkent University in Turkey, where you specialize in, and correct me if I'm wrong, but 20th century global Anglophone literatures, modernist poetry, post-secular studies. You're interested in post-colonial theory and comparative world literature, South Asian literatures, and so much more. And then a slight introduction into like what we're going to be talking about. What I wanted to do and what we're trying to create here is just a sort of conversation on success, or just like the meaning of like success for South Asian women, and how these seemingly successful South Asian women have navigated their careers among a very deep-rooted misogynistic and patriarchal culture that we come from. If anything, what I want is for the stories shared in these episodes to emphasize the importance of sharing and storytelling for South Asian communities, where I mainly consider how cultural forms of storytelling form our opinions of ourselves, of society, of our relationships with our bodies and other people. There should be some consideration on how these aspects of our culture can be used to combat the negative aspects. Now, obviously, I don't want to assume that every single person has only had negative experiences growing up. When I use the word successful, I mean it in a very subjective way. I'm curious to know what your understanding of success or personal success is, especially at like this stage in your life and in your career. Would you say that you see yourself as successful?
Success. So, for me, I think the first thing that comes to my mind when I think of women and South Asia women and success is financial independence. I know it's a very cliche thing to say. And there are complications to it. Like, for example, financial independence does also, I mean, it's entangled with it. It's tied in with a lot of the other complications, issues that we invite into our lives, in some ways. Although all of it is, I guess, maybe because I grew up with my mom was never worked. My mom was not a working woman, and so I really it started with as close as that for me to understand what it means for a woman to have to ask for 10 rupees to pay for the bus fare to go to college, from her husband, with whom she has a very complicated relationship anyways. So and 10 rupees is, that's a very legit thing for to go to college. But for every small thing, even if she just wanted to go eat a pakoda or something like that, or samosa, she has to, for every small thing she's dependent. And I see that even in women of my age, my generation, or younger. And it saddens me a lot. It kind of is like very stifling for me when I see women having to do that. Like literally, I have a friend, she's 5 years younger than me, and she's married to an Indian guy who's great, and but because she's abroad, she doesn't work yet. And I've literally seen her ask her husband, when she wants like to eat a bag of chips or something like that, she has to say, "Will you buy that for me?" Or, you know, in Hindi, she said, "Dila do na." And it breaks my heart, like when I am hanging out with these people, because I mean, and in those moments, I don't feel too proud of myself or anything like that. But I mean, I really, I really think that that's the first thing that comes to my mind. So that's success for me. Every other definition of success that we are told, culturally, like you're successful if you know how to cook, or you're successful if you have if you raise a good child or whatever. That's all I think. I mean, of course, I wouldn't adhere to all those definitions of success.
Yes.
But I think what we do, I mean, the price we pay as women, South Asian women coming from the cultures we do, for this financial independence today is a radical, drastic loss of community. And the isolation that you were talking about, I mean, I guess, for me, as long as I was in the US or Canada, I could sort of ascribe it to the community structures outside. And then I guess, like, what I did not never imagine was that sense of isolation would just become part of my life no matter where I went. And all of that is because we don't really have a place to go back to. We don't have a home to go back to, for various reasons. Culturally, we don't have a place to go back to. Logically, we don't have a place to go back to. So that's the biggest price that we pay, I guess, for financial independence. But that's success for me. Nevertheless, I mean, the ability to go anywhere in the world you want is success. I mean, maybe we're getting a little digressing a little from the sort of the topic of stories here, but I mean, all of these are stories. Yeah. One of the the other sort of aspects of crisis in this situation is also one is the isolation, but the other sort of deep crisis that I feel is because we are, as you just said, we are intelligent. I mean, these are all intelligent, educated women. Somehow they're less socially conditioned than our mothers were. So, for example, this friend I'm talking about, I do think she's grappling with a lot of very serious mental health issues, for example, right now because of these conditions. And also for whatever strange societal, cultural, economic reasons, there are women like this who actually do choose this themselves. It's not like somebody's married her off. She married this guy because he's going to go abroad, and she let go of the options she had to work in India. Of course, those were not options that were easily transferable abroad, but she let go of those options to come abroad for the sake of coming abroad, because that is, again, in our sort of register is a success in life. So if you're not able to go abroad on your own, if you go at least with your husband, you're still successful for some reason, and then you go abroad. But then this is, and then what is happening is a consequence of that. And I what I see her undergo is a deepening sort of sense of personal existential crisis. Looking back to our mothers, they probably, the conditioning helped them better for, somehow. And the crisis is deepening further and further now because it is more normal for us to actually just want to self actualize in ways that we could.
I think I'm curious to see like how like you've seen the idea of like support from the home or like support for like the woman figure, the mother, the wife at home coming from like the people around them.
Well, I don't think I can say that I have seen any such support, frankly.
Yeah.
Across all these extended, the extended family. I think the generation before us, my mother's generation, all aunts and all of that, the extended women. The generation before that, our grandmothers. So this is another thing. It's very interesting how drastically different our lives are from our grandmothers and our great grandmothers. I've actually seen my great grandmother, and it's just unbelievable how different, how far we've come in some ways also. So there was no question of, I don't know, I mean, the question of support was completely not, like, completely absent in the generations before my mother. It was just women who were just supposed, it was a completely normalized, they were just supposed to serve the family and serve children, and that's it. And when it came so in when it I am thinking of my grandmother, when it came to medical support, for example, for them, or if they run into other develop physical, like medical issues, for example, or other issues, they would just be abandoned sometimes. I mean, I am trying to figure out how to say these things, but it's true. I mean, there's a practice, and I mean, this is the kind of story that is so jarring and disturbing when you grow up in a culture, society like that, and then you grow up enough to sort of realize what's going on. There's a practice of actually abandoning women like that, like on our railway platforms, in at temples, at mosques. I don't know if that's a practice at mosques, but at temples for sure. So there was a time in my life when I suddenly realized that, oh, all of the homeless people I've grown up seeing outside temples and on railway platforms are not all beggars or all homeless. They're actually people, older people, mostly women who've been abandoned by their families. So anyway, so that's the history that we are coming from. With my mom's generation, I don't think I've ever seen any support or consideration. I think I have aunts who, worked very hard to get jobs, and then they were forced to, like forced. They didn't even want to. They were forced to leave their jobs when they got married and so on. So yeah, I don't think so. But I think with me, I would say that there has been a lot of support that I grew up with as a girl child. And I was trying to think about this while I was, preparing for this, about whether how far that had to do with because of a combination of factors. The country is suddenly growing, where there are lots of government schemes to educate girls and all of that. Society is growing to a point where men and women have to go out to work. There's suddenly a family that has a history of not supporting women at all, The first child that is born is a girl child. So what do you do? What you do end up doing is sometimes masculinize the child. You don't treat it as a girl child. You think it's a child. You know, we have to. So I think my life was a bit like that growing up, where yes, I was completely supported, and my parents still have like completely support me that I'm not married. I don't. I live abroad. I don't. You know, there's no kind of social or cultural conformity in my life in that sense. But at the same time, it's also because I think there is this understanding that I am not just the girl or the daughter. I am the oldest child of the family. I'm the one who's got the job first. You know, I am. So there's that kind of way in which I've been raised, which I think is kind of problematic too in its own way because it strips you of your femininity. So when I'm thinking of support, you know, because my mom didn't work, support also extends to just psychological support, mental support, you know, just treating the woman as, you know, a legit equal member of the family, who might just want to not to cook one day or like that sort of thing. And even that is so missing. So forget about just, you know, oh, she can go out and work. I think that would have been revolutionary for a man too. But I think what, you know, what looms larger in my mind is just even at home, inside the house. There was so little of that just understanding the woman, even if she's happy just, you know, handling a house and raising a kid, just understanding from a day to day, every moment, just being able to give her the dignity of a complete person and a mother and a wife and all of that. So that's also so like that's where I've seen the crisis. It's a real crisis of human dignity, and not just that sort of support. But I feel like, you know, I was seeing this somewhere. Some friend posted a reel or something like that, um, and talked about how, because it is our general millennials actually grew up seeing our parents this way, or the way we processed it for some reason. It was a very optimistic point that they were making, that it's a pleasure to see millennials actually now create homes, you know, where, and which is true. I think I can attest to that. I think in, at least in the metropolitan centers in India, and friends that I have of my generation who are married, men and women, heterosexual marriages, more often than not, I see a complete shift. There isn't even that understanding that this is a man's job or a woman's job sort of thing, like the friends that whose homes I have been to. But at the same time, I think our society has, in our generation, become very polar. So I've also seen, sometimes I've ended up talking to my parents about this, in a way where I'm telling them that, you know, I think your generation was the last generation that at least had some sense of decency, some sense of, you know, okay, like sort of, it came from conditioning, it came from social conditioning, but you were like, okay, a man would be like, even if he didn't know what supporting his wife meant, he would be like, okay, this is my wife, I shouldn't do this. I feel like we're sort of losing that too. There's a deeper crisis where I see, as much as I see my friends who, you know, there is no sense of gendering at home, for example. There's certainly a turn towards more conservative sometimes in a large section of people who are much younger than me. I see women, for example. There's a like there are the kind of, so on one hand you have women. I think it's definitely very interesting to see women kind of, what do you call it, like capturing their daily lives on social media and all of that. And on the other hand, there are all these like sort of channels I don't understand where women are saying, like making husband like lunch for their husband or something like that, and they're like vlogging it, basically showing off how carefully they're making lunch for their husband. This is really like 20 year olds, 20, I mean, not 20 to 25ish or something. Yeah, that part I don't understand. I feel like I've been living too long away from the culture as well to really understand the ramifications of it, the how would this happen, what kind of life they have. And I mean, of course, there is, you know, because we're living in a globalized kind of world, it's not even within South Asia, so it's not and strictly a divide between the urban and the metropolitan and all of that anymore. It's just all everywhere. What I said, you know, at the very beginning, we were talking about how the cost of financial independence or independence or becoming a human subject, you know, from our cultures. That's how I see it philosophically, frankly, at this point. To be able to be able to access, to be able to claim human dignity and subjectivity, you know, you need to get away. somehow. And then you just keep getting away because there's no way going back. That's what I meant by no way going back. And this is one of the most visceral things, the most disturbing things of our lives. That when we go back, when I go back even now, I mean, I don't feel comfortable just walking the streets. It's as fundamental as that. I come from a small town, not a big city. In the small town, I'm going back after 10 years of having not lived there. But people know me. Some people know me. So people who know me, first of all, people in our culture don't have they don't know when to stop staring at you, even for unsexy reasons. So I'm like walking down the street, with all the poor civic planning and all of that. So it's really difficult to kind of even walk. Like have spaces where you can walk, and then and then there are people who are staring at me for curiosity, making me really uncomfortable, and every other man is just staring at you. And I'm thinking, as you were saying this, I was thinking about this, the social psychology, the idea of living a human life. Is it completely different from how the kind of mentality or mindset the social psychologist constitutes our spaces like that? You know what I mean? What I'm trying to say is that, is it that every man who goes out into the streets thinks he's a woman and thinks, she's a sexual object? Is it possible for you to live like that? I mean, is that the kind of social space that we are like constituting as people? Is it even possible? Like, for example, what would it take for me to get out into the street and think every man I see I'm going to sexualize? Like, that's just so weird. And so I think that's what constantly happens, no matter if these men are married, not married, not. So that's the social space we're talking about. These are not spaces that are built for, individuals, for human subjects, where you can, walk down the road thinking about something, for example.
Right.
You just there, fit you have to fit yourself in this kind of sexual, like being a sexual object, even if nobody's touching you, in this, to be just in the space. And then the veiling, of course, like I mean, there's been so much debate going through college. I remember all the women, would always debate about whether you should, conform, or not. And right, like this is the whole thing. And I think I've always belonged, and even now I think I would rather just take a dupatta or something like that than having people just stare at my breasts or something like that. Like, I mean, and I have lots of friends who went the other way, would be like, I'm just going to do what I want to do. The first things that came to my mind were the like the stories we grew up listening to, right? There was the story that I'll talk about, all the Mahabharata stories that I grew up reading and listening to, because that's what if you're talking about what stories were you told when you were growing up, there were these stories from the epics. It was very significant in the manner in which they were told, they were communicated, the kind of literature we were exposed to. Actually, this is my personal experience, at least. I was growing up in a middle class family from suburban India, quite progressive, like a bit of what is it, bourgeoisie family. Like, I mean, all of my grandfather, my father, all of them were government servants. So that's the class and the caste sort of intersection I'm talking about. I'm Savarna, not very upper caste, but Savarna nevertheless. Or actually, well, I don't know. Let's say this, I'm having to think. I come from an intercaste marriage, so where my mother is a Brahmin and my father is like an upper caste Savarna person, but not very high up in the caste. This thing also. So that's the intersection I'm coming from, and I feel like that's why I had access to all the literature that I had access to, where these are stories from Balakrishna or something like that, or which is very fascinating. That those are the stories that I grew up with, really. And the storytelling was very interesting. I spent a lot of my childhood with my grandfather, and I remember when he would put me to sleep, he's like, somehow I was trying to kind of remember actually what stories he would tell, how he would tell. And one or two of the story things that I think he would tell me stories from a bunch of places, but definitely the sort of like the high intellectual ethical kind of stories, like from the Mahabharata, for example. And it would be kind of told in a very immediate way, in the sense like, maybe he's talking to me, maybe he's like, oh, you should sleep tomorrow. Yeah. And then he'll be seeing me you have school in the morning, and he'd be singing a lullaby or something, and suddenly he's like, oh, I'd tell him, like, tell me a story or something, and then he'd be like, oh, okay, so So there was this, and suddenly it would be like the episode of, say, for example, this is an episode that was so intriguing to me as a child. That's why I remember this episode from the Mahabharata where, have you heard of this? It's called the Chakra Vyuha episode. Like, so, the Chakra Vyuha is like a very spiral, special, complex military formation. And in the Mahabharata, in during the war of the Battle of Kurukshetra, there's a special episode where the prince of the Pandavas, their child, the son, his name is Abhimanyu. He is the son of Arjuna, and he's a 16-year-old boy, but he has a wife for some reason, Uttara, who's pregnant also, with the son who becomes the monarch later on, Parikshit. Abhimanyu is the beloved of all, and he's the youngest in the battle and all of that. And it's like the Chakravyuha is a formation, a military formation that you really need to be a big, like, sort of great hero. You need to know how to enter it and defeat the enemy and come out of it. Now, Arjuna knew how to do that. All the great, the heroes knew how to break the Chakravyuha. Abhimanyu knew half of it because Abhimanyu his mom was pregnant with him when his dad told him the trick to get out of the Chakravyuha. But his mom Suhadra, she fell asleep before she heard how the way out of the Chakravyuha. So Abhimanyu did not hear the way out. He knew how to get in, but he didn't know how to get out. And on this day of the episode, all his father and the uncles and all of them, they were kind of tricked away because the enemy really wanted to kill Abhimanyu and therefore could psychologically break down the enemy, the other party as well. And Abhimanyu thought that he knew the way and he just went in and he died. So this is one of the most tragic later episodes in the Mahabharata, on the Battle of Kurukshetra. And this whole thing, like suddenly my grandfather would be like, oh, so Abhimanyu is getting into Chakravyuha, and and this is happening, that person says this, that person says this, meanwhile his dad is away, and then he's there and he's thinking this, and he had heard this part until this part, and then he didn't. And suddenly this is just, I don't know, this is mind boggling how uh this complex intellectual and ethical story was just told, so like that, just like that, when you're trying to fall asleep as a child. And then and it's so tragic, and then you sort of feel really I remember looking outside the window and look at the kind of skyline above it and kind of imagine, imagine that Chakravyuha scene, like somewhere under the sky that happened, somewhere on this land or something. And that's the kind of, like, I guess the storyscape that I'm talking about, that we grew up with. And then grow up, then a very different kind of story emerges. We're going to go to college, for example, and you read stories of by Mashweta Devi, you read stories by Mandato, you read stories by Ishma Chugtai. And these are stories that shock you. They are a very different kind of world of the story, and then the stories that you grew up with. And both of those stories are South Asian stories, That's what I was kind of trying to get at. And those are stories that are so difficult. The mantra stories, for example. I mean, there are times when it's like a miracle that we're able to digest these stories. Like, you never anticipated what these stories would be. And then once you read, your life is changed forever. They're life altering stories. And then you're basically kind of in some ways shocked and traumatized for your whole life because you know these stories. And so that's also, and then somehow there's this kind of added pressure, I think. I was talking to a friend a few days ago, who's a fellow academic in India. And I think one of the things that I was talking about the Indian literature curriculum or something like that. And one of the things he started telling me about all of these different kind of, anthologies they were teaching of Indian literature, of regional literatures, of the various language regions and so on. Basically, if you look at the people who have theorized and talked more critically about storytelling traditions in South Asia, we have, of course, like people like A.K. Ramanujan and all whom we teach. The thrust is on plurality, right? Like we are a multilingual. There's so much plurality in society, so much religious plurality, cultural plurality, linguistic plurality, and therefore the storytelling practice has to be constantly expansive and accommodating all of those storytelling traditions, all of those stories, the multiplicity of stories, which is great. But as I was listening to my friend talk about all the anthologies and all of this, I was also thinking about how we are kind of like this multiplicity can become like a burden on us sometimes. Like as if we come out of their culture having forced to reckon with the multiplicity, the irreconcilable multiplicities, and we get this kind of ethical education for sure. But are we the people who need that ethical education as much as so many other people in the world who need that ethical education? And yet you just sort of the stories like Manto's are kind of we're the one who are it's our story and we read it, whereas somebody else needs to read it in order to understand, like to make our lives better, I think. And then I feel like there are so many situations in my life when, as I'm traveling the world, it's like it's the burden again is on me. First of all, I'm the one who's most traumatized by reading a Mantu story. I have the burden is on me to having to constantly translate that and justify the importance of it. Kind of sometimes even censor myself because the other person is too fragile or whatever. And then I have to go back. It's I who has to go back and live in that society and live out one of those stories. Anyway, so that's also the story of of South Asia that I was thinking about. And I guess when it comes to these names I mentioned, Mahashweta Devi or Manto, that's just our life. Those other stories that we grow up seeing, even at home, everywhere else. The most shocking, the most jarring, unbelievable, incredible stories. Yeah, and I feel like, I mean, also, there's like a lot of these children's shows and all of that, where like Chota Bheem and all of those things, Ganesha, whatever, little Ganesha. And like, I mean, I think there's a way, I mean, I see all the children I see there at their home in the neighborhood are like growing up watching these scenes. But I think this is where I go back to, the essay that I taught at the beginning of this course on short fiction that I taught this semester, Walter Benjamin, the storyteller, where Benjamin is talking about what the storytelling act is and like how revolutionary that is, how important that is, how communal that is, and all of that. And I think there's something in that, in the storyteller, in the way that I would tell my grandfather the very following day. This is a very, very Benjaminian observation that I would tell my grandfather the very following day, tell me about that story again.
Yeah.
And there would be that different rendering, a rendition of it. And I would sort of imagine something different looking out the window. So there's definitely that. Now again, there are all these traps in our culture. When I say, oh, of course now we need. Of course, my parents were not telling me these stories. My grandparents were.
Yeah.
So your grandparents who live with you in that complicates our cultural situation again.
Yeah.
So I don't know. There are all these traps where you can't be sort of really making statements that are so clean, for that matter. That
Yeah.
read those stories, but also it's okay that that's not possible too. We somehow that's how I feel when it comes to our culture.
Yeah, there's like a good and a bad. So even in having those stories told to you, you get this exposure to culture and to, I don't know,
Mm.
ideas that you wouldn't be exposed to. There's sense of just like there's literacy associated with it. There's like knowledge and learning and thinking and creativity that's being fostered through it.
And I also just want to kind of clarify. I mean, again, this is something that I've already mentioned, but like kind of to again restate this that uh, I'm talking. I mean, I've had a very unique experience coming from this culture in that sense that yes, I mean, I were not told stories where I think sometimes I think if my mom were telling me a story, she'd tell me a story about like the king and his two queens, who are one of them is a bad queen or a good queen, like that sort of thing. There are all kinds of stories that, I mean, alternative setup. A child could be growing up listening to, in our culture, listening to stories where they are told you need to be like the good queen or you need to be like this good woman or whatever, a good wife. Somehow it's part of my being, I guess, not treated so much as a girl child or aggressively not treated as a girl child, where my grandfather would kind of censor stories that heavily featured on marriage or like the stuff like that. This is very weird to hear, but that's how it was. And
Right.
so that was specific to my. And then I went to a college, and studied the humanities. So I was that was a whole different other kind of education that I got, which is not mainstream at all. Right. That's my point. That's just it's definitely not mainstream. So this is one of the things that I was struggling with while I was thinking about how to respond to your questions. That how do I really grasp, like really talk about. I mean, I know that's not necessary, but to kind of the mainstream South Asian storytelling experience, um, or is there anything as such? And media, for example, becomes as I was thinking about, okay, what happens to kids who don't study the humanities, who go to engineering colleges, who then become professionals? What are the stories that they're growing up with, or they're like sort of watching or being exposed to in their adulthood? And maybe some of it is the media. That's a very, very complex, wide kind of space as well of storytelling.
Right. And Manto's very interesting to me because for me growing up, the first experience that I had, like introduction to Manto, was my maternal grandfather getting very angry that Manto's name was mentioned around him. And then I like whispered to my mom and I was like, what's happening? Why is this bad? I was a kid at that time. Like I was like younger than 10 years old. And she was like, "No, he doesn't like it." Because the affiliation was he writes about topics and themes and stories that are not decent and moral for women to know.
Yeah.
And so it should not be mentioned in front of women, which I guess also kind of translates a conversation towards the next thing, which was like when we look at like cultural kind of like stereotypes and storytelling, I realized within this conversation that a lot of that socialization just from observations and experience is like feeding a sense of like naivety into women, like this extreme simplicity into what you should reduce yourself down to in order to be suitable for other people. And there's kind of like no sense of like self in there, and that extends to like how you should dress, how you should talk, how your temperament should be, what your personality should be like. And it just, I think based off of like our conversation, the sense of it that I'm getting is like that was not as heavily imposed on you. So do you feel like you had more room to kind of discover your likes and your passions and yourself like apart from what was expected?
I think so. I would say so. But I do, trying to think of where it happened. Where, was it at home? Was it everywhere? Was it once you went to college? I think for me it was all throughout. But I do have friends who I met in college, who for whom the going to college, which I went to I went to a public university, where I did a humanities course. So if this is the most quote unquote useless education in India, the perceived useless education in India that you can get. And yet, I think a lot of the growing up happened in college for a lot of us. The self actualization, the becoming, who we are today. Yeah. So I would say that I don't know. I don't think back. I'm not able to remember a time when, or maybe that's the thing. Like it's been so I've been so far away from all of those contexts of being told what to do. Like because once you've lived life, like undercutting those things,
Yeah.
to a certain extent, to a large extent, for after a very long time, it just stops mattering. Unless you want to plug yourself back into that system and kind of tell yourself those things again, which I see a lot of women very sadly again try to do as well. Like for example, if I were to try to get married today, I'd have to deal with a lot of those issues. And it's about unlearning a lot of things you've learned, and, or become, and then, and that leads to all of the social conflicts that we have today. But if I may ask you, what is the story? How would you define the story that you had for this podcast, or,
I think I wanted to talk about the stories that were told through people's stories. It like what I notice, and when I look back, your grandmother tells your mother tells you follow it and you say it on, and it's supposed to just like recycle. And that was like the main reason why I was like these conversations need to happen, because the reason I think my mother was able to break out of at least half of those was because I went to college and I started forcing her out of those conversations, being like, why do you think this is necessary? Why is it indecent for my shoulder to be visible to my father? A shoulder should not be the problem. Like, everyone knows that women wear bras or that women have periods. Like, the type of stigma that we assign to every single thing that is associated with being female is just
True, true.
it's aggravating.
Yeah. Yeah, and I relate to that completely. I think my mom was a lot less conditioned. I think. I mean, she was definitely like like a rebel.
Yeah.
Even though she did, she lived a pretty conventional life, and yet she was always a rebel. Discontent, and we know this from like our training in philosophy, that like how discontent it basically can be like resistance. And my for my mom, discontent with who she was, where she was had landed up in, her whole life, like so full of discontent, which is like actually makes our had growing up, I think had definitely made my life difficult.
Yeah.
But I also realized that her unwillingness to conform is what made me, at least she struggled with the discontent. She was never the conventional kind of woman. And then even despite that, I think the thing about the shoulder that you're talking about, it was with my mom, it was with wearing bras at home. Like I have to keep wearing the bra, which is
Yeah.
fine. I mean, I would want to do that. But like not wearing shorts, we come from a hot climate. So not wearing shorts at home. But what I see is my sister is your age, like what, 11 years younger than me. I think she's never like she's easier with my sister with those things. Somehow this idea of my sister is no matter how old she grows, she's still the child.
Yeah.
And so that takes over. But I like sort of now I've normalized talking about periods in front of my father. I've normalized I'll right now, like, I wear the clothes I do, and I don't think my parents feel like they can have the authority to tell me how to dress in my own house, kind of
Right.
thing. So that's a constant negotiation.
And it's like I don't think that the like like the average middle class housewife is to blame for that because it's a much bigger structural problem.
Well, and I think, like, the story of progress, adding to the last point that you were talking about parents, like, ongoing an ongoing conversation happening with parents and them accepting what we do, our choices, and so on. I think the story of progress, and this takes us back to the where we began. The story of success is, in some ways, is also like it warms my heart when I see. I think with my parents, both my parents having aged now, and because of the kind of conversations we've had through all these years, I see now when they are in my house or they are living with me, somehow it feels like like I am not the odd one out in the house trying to be rebellious or trying to battle, like with them being ensconced in in tradition, and I'm the other outlier trying to rebel and break away. Instead, they've moved away from the tradition in some way, very very organically, and now they're living around me,
Yeah.
like not, and I'm living very very radically. So, and it's not like they are having a lot of difficulty in society, and because they're seeing five other women like me, and all of that is, I think that's what I recognize as kind of social, like a story of progress where you don't really have to leave, you don't really have to break away, you get to pull the pull what is behind you, kind of along, you trail along. I think it's not even like, as a girl child, I don't know. I was born in 90 in the I mean in 1990, so I grew up in the 90s in India, suburban India. As a girl child, I don't remember a time that I just did not exist as a normal regular kid, who just, was not like, it's not like I was born with an understanding of how to be a girl.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that rebellion to the wanting to be treated as a regular kid, as a regular kid, as in just a human being, like a child, irrespective of my gender or whatever, just to be treated as, so get all the opportunities. I should go to school. I should be fed well. I should be, taken care of. All of those people, I was just like, I don't remember ever kind of waking up to this realization that I need to be treated well because I'm a girl, like even despite the fact that I'm a girl, that sort of thing.
I was watching like home videos from when I was younger, and I was surprised to see that I used to wear dresses as a kid because like I don't even have memories of those things anymore because at some point it was just cut off so instantly, you know. You suddenly had to like, even though you're like what 11, 12, you need to act like a woman now because the men
Yeah.
around you, it's not safe.
Yeah. But see, this is where I'd sort of add like just one more point here, Walija. It's like, so those are sort of external constraints. I
Right.
didn't mean to make them secondary or anything like that. That you know the kind of clothes we wore, even now the clothing like the clothes I wear when I'm back in India. Do I really relate to it? Have I ever related to it? You know, did the clothes we wore as kids were even more ridiculous, like the frocks and everything, like but the way I feel internally about that is that that has never like if I were to go back to India and wear a salwar kameez and put a dupatta because that's just easier for me, that doesn't take away who I am.
Right.
Like it doesn't take away or define me in any way. Like I could, if I wanted to, I could still wear my Western clothes and invite a few stares.
Yeah.
Or I might not do that, and you know, and I mean, when I wear Western clothes also abroad, I mean, it's not like I'm quite ill at ease in them. Like it's not that I've, you know, frankly, that's what I realized about my life. Like I think being a woman from our culture, you just need to be. You probably sometimes most of us will feel ill at ease everywhere we go.
Yeah.
And the stuff that we wore back home, if that made us made us ill at ease, that is just one of those one form of ill at ease. Even if I wear a dupatta, even if I wear like a whole thing, I wear a sari and I wrap myself up entirely, there'll be still people staring at me. And the stares are again, as I said, they're not sometimes even the non-sexual gaze is kind of really enough to make you feel uncomfortable. I also think about this sometimes in terms of like for example it's yeah I mean the sexualization is the problem which is also like the violence of course but how much of it is the sexualization not allowing dignity to the woman, you know what I mean?
In going over this conversation and then looking at these questions, was there a theoretical or literary framework or just any text that you would perhaps suggest other scholars to think of storytelling in South Asia, or like just the importance of it for South Asian women?
In terms of literary theoretical framework, okay, you know, one thing I thought about was this, and I think I try to demonstrate it with through my example of the Mahabharata story, is that sort of so on one hand, you know, our culture, the storytelling in our culture has to be plural, it has to be inclusive, it has to be expansive. There's constantly our culture is a culture where every 100 kilometers you have a different food culture and and a different language, right? So, you know, there are so many stories, and so you kind of stories are sometimes also about you know that encounter with alterity that we talk about, and stories are such small units. So if there are so many stories that you're surrounded with, that many kind of encounters with alterity you're having you're faced with. And I think that is our culture. We are constantly bombarded with encountering um, absolutely different, absolutely unbelievable, incredible stories constantly. And there is no assumption. I mean, can you, is there any end to trying to understand our culture? No, I still don't, I don't think, I think it surprises me, you know, every day, like the kind of things that I see coming out of there every story. So that's one aspect of the storytelling of South Asian storytelling. The other aspect is that of the like the sort of alternative temporalities, or do you want to call it that? The ways in which stories from different times, different realms can kind of just exist amongst us, you know, in a very. And I think this is not just exclusive to our culture. I think this is, this is part of every culture in some way that, you know, the old Mahabharata story could just be part of a very ordinary experience like that, where I'm trying to go to sleep or my grandfather is putting me to sleep. And so, what do you call it? Interjected into my historical moment. Is it historical? Is it cultural? Is it some kind of like fabula? Like, is it a sort of didactic story? Or is it a whole, so that the whole, as I said, the complex intellectual, ethical unit that is the Mahabharata story is suddenly just thrown at you, you know, as a child. That's also so so telling about our culture.
I guess I was also wondering, like, in that, did you then think of like a question that you would have for a fellow scholar, or like something that you would like to know more about, or something that you should consider people should work on?
Yeah, I think there's a quite a bit of work already happening, but I think that alterity thing that I talked about, I think that's something that has a lot of scope, and the growing difference, as it were, the massive difference, the endless, unending differentiation in our culture. To be able to reckon with that. So I'm thinking of Dalit studies, for example, when I'm thinking of the Indian context. And there's already a lot of, so what I was trying to think of, if I've ever read a Dalit story, I think I've read a novella, um, but uh, but then that's a good important question to ask. Being an insider to our culture, what are the stories we don't know yet? Whose stories we don't know yet? How many stories we don't know yet? That's I think a question that we have to constantly keep asking. And how do we know the stories? Like, does our society, does our culture really afford us those stories easily? What do we have to do to bring those stories to the forefront? I think our culture, especially because of the multiplicity and the complexity of the culture, there's just so much of that. That's a very, very important question. As so, to one of the questions you had in the list was, I think, towards the end, like some fiction, a work of fiction that you would recommend, or some. So for that, and because I was thinking of stories, I immediately thought of this book that called The Palace of Illusions by Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni. Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni, she's a diasporic writer,
Okay.
based in the US. And her novel called The Palace of Illusions, it's actually the story of the Mahabharata told from the point of view of Draupadi. And it's a novel. So it compresses the whole epic into the novel, and it's wonderful. She's a beautiful prose writer, and I think this novel was one of the most memorable novels I read in my undergrad, during my undergrad years, or a little later, I think. And then the other novel I wanted to mention, the work in South Asian work that I wanted to mention, which also had a huge impact on me in the form of a story. Again, it was a little longer than a story. It's a novella. It's called Samskara, by this writer called U.R. Ananthamurthy, who's a Kannada writer, but was translated. I think A.K. Ramanujan probably translated Samskara from Kannada into English. And Samskara means, what is Samskar? Is it tradition, like ritual? Samskar is also this kind of a kind of a conditioning of ethical values, like values and ethics. I think that all of that combination of all of that, as is very typical of our words from our culture, that they're just this composite of meanings. So it's that. But what it is what that novel is about, this one man, or the protagonist is a priest. Is a kind of an ascetic priest, but he's also a Brahmin who's a responsible man in society, and kind of his encounter with alterity. Like, I think uh, it is a process of him trying reckoning with parts of himself that he hadn't accepted, that was not socially kind of legit, or whatever. Now, but it's a novel about this explosion of self awareness, of reckoning with the alterity outside and inside, and so on. Anyway, but I when I was thinking about both of these works, I was thinking about these are very, very important stories coming from our culture. Now, one thing that I see kind of sometimes diminishing in our conversations, especially literary conversations, through this example that I mentioned about my friend talking about, like, all the anthologies and all of that, is digging deeper into philosophical questions, to put it very simply. To not just, like, sometimes it can just become about identity markers, about identities, about the plurality, about the multiplicity, just to kind of make a list of all the people, whose stories we're missing. And we need to, sometimes I feel like the space for philosophical speculation. What does it, speculation, especially of stories of the self, stories of the individual, like the subject itself. I feel like there's a crisis of that deep digging in our culture now. Yeah, I don't know how much of it has to do with being like self asserting ourselves as post-colonial citizens or post-colonial subjects, where we want to believe that this because we are post-colonial subjects, we are so and so and so. Um, and so I would say that I that's what I feel like we should have more and more. Not to say that that's not happening or that's not there at all. I'm just saying that that's coming from there's a even if you're looking at the tradition of literature, this tradition of stories in our culture, there's a lot of room for that kind of self-reckoning that our stories afford us, and I think that's something that is worth continuing.